Hi, good afternoon. We're going to talk about food for today and beyond from a youth perspective. First, we're going to look at food systems. What are the elements, the drivers of food systems? And in that backdrop, what does youth engagement and employment or engaging and making sure that they part actively involved, how does it look like in a food system? And of course, we're going to look at one example maybe of how we can engage young people, which is through digital ag or digital agriculture. So for food systems drivers, you have different categories, one being infrastructure drivers that help facilitate the activities that happen from production to consumption. Biophysical and environmental drivers also affect how food systems work or exist, and so it could hamper or it could also push the efficiency and outputs of food supply chains. Innovation and technology drivers would be looking at how the activities in the food systems are actually made more efficient over time given new and up-to-date technologies. Social cultural drivers would shape how people exist within food systems. So that would be your social norms, cultural preferences, and religion and tradition that would affect how people choose their food. Political and economic drivers, where policies and ordinances actually set the policy environment in which food systems and supply chains exist in and how they actually function. Demographic drivers would look at your population growth, your urbanization, education levels, and income growth. And with a backdrop of COVID-19 pandemic, you'd see how these different sets of drivers actually change rapidly and drastically during the pandemic. And so we have to set that into context. And in that context, think about how young people can be engaged. But before I go there, we have to look at also what is the policy push at the global level on engaging or at least looking at youth engagement and employment. The UN Committee on World Food Security commissioned the high-level panel of experts to create a report on promoting youth engagement and employment in agriculture and food systems. I happen to be part of the 7-team member of the HLPE that is working on this report, and you would see in this diagram how the HLPE interacts with the CFS. So the HLPE is the science and policy interface of the CFS. The report will go into plenary, wherein hopefully with consensus the UN member states and other stakeholders would also approve of the report, and then that would snowball into policy action across member states who would also adopt that. So the CFS is basically seen in this diagram where you have advisory group participants coming from civil society mechanism, UN institutions, UN research institutions, financial institutions, private sector mechanism, and philanthropic foundations. The CFS Secretariat serves the UN food agencies serve as the CFS Secretariat, namely your FAO, IFAD, and WFP. So what does the report look into? The report basically looks into the factors to youth engagement and employment. What are the ways or perspectives in terms of how we engage young people? And the report actually alludes to the rights, the agency, the equity, and even the recognition of young people. Youth access to resources, looking at access of young people to knowledge, capacity building, finances, capital, markets, programs that would help them build and incubate their ideas, and many more. Aspects related to employment, salaries, job security in the agriculture sector, the safety of young people who work in factories that may be hazardous at times given the nature of the work. And so these are the working conditions that we're also tackling that young people are vulnerable to in the context of working in the agriculture and food systems. We also look at the potential of territorial approaches as a framework, analyzing the social, technological, economic, environmental, political, institutional aspects of a geographic region and how it engages and employs young people in agriculture and food systems. We also look at the rural urban linkages to provide more and better jobs for women and youth. And so, given that context, food systems drivers, the policy environment that's being pushed also at the global level, it's important to look at how youth participation can be streamlined across food systems. Especially we're talking about Food System Summit, and we want to highlight the value that young people bring in. And so we have to make sure there are mechanisms that allow young people to be actively involved across the food system. This would help organizations assess how they are engaging young people. There are 6 dimensions of participation according to Rasch, and I just put it into the context of agri-food systems development. One is activity of participation. Can youth discuss, give their opinions and options during planning, especially in developmental programs being designed, being planned out, and being implemented? Second, power sharing. Do authorities share power and formalize mechanisms in which young people can be part of decision making? Or are they just there to say, okay, we'll take the program? Or can they actually say what they want to say in shaping developmental programs? Fairness, equality. Do young people have equal chances to influence planning of direction of food systems? Do they actually have the necessary capacity that allows them to be part of the whole process to say, this is what we want in the food system that we live in? Transparency. Are young people informed and made aware with the key processes that happen to shape food systems? With a systems framework, you normally have your input, process, and output. And normally in the process, this sometimes or most of the time is seen as a black box where you don't really know what specific things are going on for as long as there are outputs which are developmental programs that benefit young people. But do we include young people into the process that takes place within the black box? Are they made aware about how these processes take place? And we have to make sure that there is a transparency towards young people with how these processes, these decisions are made, and that young people can give their voice even at that stage. Flexibility. Does participation happen when major aspects of project design are still open for discussion? Is it applicable? Is it open to young people's participation? Or is it very rigid and that young people just have to follow? What is the reach? Is participation limited to a select few or a larger number of young people? Is it limited to people who agencies already know? Or are we creating mechanisms to involve larger representations of youth to make their voices heard and take their voices and inputs to design the program so that it benefits them? When I said about digital spaces being a way or a touch point to engage young people, we could take this as an example. The data from Hootsuite shows that with social media advertising, you actually reach these numbers. And from the age range of 13 to 34 years old, you actually have these numbers, which would show you about 40.7 million of within this age range are female, 37.7 million are male. And you're looking at this group of demographic that has the capacity to change and influence food systems in terms of what they choose to buy, what they choose to eat, and how they want their food to be produced. There is a huge capacity and potential within this age range. And how are we engaging them? How are we making sure that we're not only engaging a handful of young people, going back to the dimension of reach? Are we talking only to 10 young people that are involved in policy advocacy work or doing business? Or are we listening to the larger number of young people that actually have a voice, that actually want to say something about what kind of food system they want to live in? And so this is it gives you a glimpse of the age range and the numbers that we could tap into when we reach young people through digital spaces. So to give further example, and this is not a silver bullet, of course, but we have to address first of all the digital divide. When we talked about food system drivers, we mentioned infrastructure, and digital infrastructure is a gap that exists in society that people who don't have internet connectivity could lose access to more critical information that would help them shape their lives better and also help them make the right decisions within the food systems they belong to. So digital infrastructure is crucial, and it's important to address that so that we don't exacerbate pre-existing social inequalities rather, that already we've seen especially in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. And so that has to be addressed. And another example, which is, of course, again, I emphasize this is not a silver bullet solution, but Agriculture 4.0 has a capacity and potential to also engage young people at a level that they're comfortable with, because they are, as literature would also say, digital natives, where a lot of young people have grown in the technology environment already, and so they know how to interact with technology. And so maximizing that and looking at how we can engage young people, attract young people, retain young people in agriculture and food systems, we can introduce them to different types of Agriculture 4.0 models, like farming through Internet of Things, big data analytics, drones, automated processes across the supply chain, not only in production but also even in the logistical parts, e-commerce platforms that help move commodities around. So those are some examples. And of course, when we talk about utilizing digital spaces, we have to also consider that young people are able to access the necessary information so that they can also shape food systems according to how they feel and want food systems to look like. Meaning, we have to change the traditional model of agriculture being supply driven to a more consumer and market oriented and market driven food supply or food system. Meaning, the kind of food that is nutritious, healthy, and what consumers want should drive the production patterns and also the logistical arrangements that make the food materials available to consumers. With all that said, I want to finish off with this: that when we talk about food and beyond, when we talk about youth in the context of food systems, we have to think about food security being national security. It is tantamount to national security. We cannot talk about food systems or a sustainable development or a resilient future if we're not talking about ensuring that that huge bulge of demographic is not engaged across the food supply chains, across food systems, from production to consumption, we have to ensure that they are empowered, employed, and can employ other people so that we can achieve together food security, so that we can achieve national security. Thank you.